Hey there, nostalgia lovers! Welcome to Nostalgia Area. What if I told you your history books were holding out on you? That some of the most shocking, world-changing, and downright brutal events in human history never made the cut? Let's be real, history class often felt like a greatest hits album on repeat. Same kings, same wars, same revolutions. Basically a cure for insomnia. But by focusing on the highlight reel, we miss the messy, uncomfortable stories that actually explain how the world works today. Buried in the margins are massacres, revolutions, and disasters that shaped everything around us, but got left out because they were too controversial, too brutal, or didn't fit the official story. Well, today we're digging them up. Here are 10 of the most important historical events your teachers probably skip. We all learned about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and maybe even the Russian one. But what about the time when the famously polite British executed their own king? From 1642 to 1651, Parliament and Royalists fought a brutal series of battles that ended with King Charles I being tried and beheaded.
Moses' membership dates from the early days of the King's Army.
Yep, Britain went full Game of Thrones before HBO even existed. The conflict killed a greater proportion of England's population than World War I, and it laid the foundation for Western democracy. Yet in school, it usually gets a passing mention, if that. So the next time politics feel messy, just remember, at least no one's solving things with a royal decapitation. Yet. We've all heard about Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to a church door. What textbooks often leave out is the catastrophic chain reaction it caused. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648.
I cannot and I will not retract anything.
Think of it as Europe's ultimate family feud. Protestant versus Catholic states. Mercenaries running wild, villages burned, famine everywhere. Some German regions lost half their population. Half. Imagine half your town disappearing. It's unthinkable. The war finally ended with treaties that gave us the principle of national sovereignty, countries ruling themselves without outside interference. That idea underpins international law today. But in class, you get a few sentences, then boom, on to the French Revolution. When Europeans came to the Americas, they didn't just bring ships, guns, and awkward facial hair. They brought disease. Starting in the 1500s, waves of smallpox tore through indigenous populations.
Smallpox is an acute infectious disease that today is a serious problem in Asia.
The result was a demographic collapse on a scale that's hard to even comprehend. The disease wiped out up to 90% of the population in some communities. Entire nations vanished. This wasn't just a tragic accident. It made colonization much easier. It's hard to resist invaders when 9 out of 10 people are dead or dying. Textbooks sometimes mention disease as a factor, but rarely convey the apocalyptic scale. The reality is, smallpox reshaped 2 continents far more than any musket or cannon. In 1918, while World War I was winding down, a new conflict was just heating up. The Bolshevik Revolution had toppled the Tsar, and Lenin's new communist government pulled Russia out of the war.
That's when the former Russian Empire was rocked by not one, but 2 revolutions.
Fearing that communism would spread, the Allied powers, including the US, Britain, and Japan, did something stunning. They invaded Russia. Why? To crush communism before it spread. Yep, the Allies actually tried to strangle the Soviet Union in its crib. But the plan was a disaster. Poor strategy, bad logistics, no clear goals. By 1920, they bailed, and the Bolsheviks secured power. If it had worked, the Cold War might never have existed. But since it didn't, we got decades of nuclear standoffs instead. Oops. On July 17, 1944, at a segregated naval base near San Francisco, one of the deadliest home front disasters of World War II unfolded. African-American sailors were ordered to load thousands of tons of bombs and ammunition onto ships with no real training.
Of African Americans enlisted to join the fight against the Axis and serve bravely.
That night, 2 ships loaded with nearly 5,000 tons of explosives blew up. The blast was immense, vaporizing 320 men. The surviving black sailors were ordered right back to work under the exact same deadly conditions. 50 sailors refused and were charged with mutiny. The outrage sparked by Port Chicago exposed deep racism in the U.S. military, helping to lead to desegregation under President Truman. Yet this deadly disaster, most history classes skip right over it. If you are interested in learning more about the events featured in this video, check out the links in the description for books, documentaries, and more. March 25, 1911. A New York garment factory bursts into flames, and within minutes...
On the 25th of March, 1911, a fire began at the premises of the Triangle Waist Company.
The whole place is a death trap. Why? The factory owners, worried about workers taking unauthorized breaks, had locked the exit doors. The fire escape was so flimsy it buckled and collapsed like a cheap folding chair. In just 18 minutes, 146 workers died. Most were young immigrant women and girls who either burned, suffocated, or jumped from the windows. The tragedy sent a shockwave across the country. Public outrage was so immense it forced a wave of reform. New York passed over 30 new laws regulating workplace safety, fire codes, and working hours, setting a standard for the rest of the nation. You've probably heard of the Trail of Tears.
And the trader said, well, the Indians owe me that because they've been ichazoing here.
But the version taught in schools often sanitizes the sheer, calculated cruelty. Between 1830 and 1840, the U.S. government forcibly ripped tens of thousands of Native Americans from their homes and forced them to march hundreds of miles into so-called Indian territory. Let's call this what it was: a campaign of ethnic cleansing. This was not a simple relocation. It was a death march. Thousands of men, women, and children died from disease, starvation, and exposure along the way. The Trail of Tears is a horrifying chapter of American history, driven by a systematic government policy to seize land for profit. For a full decade, from 1966 to 1976, China was thrown into violent chaos.
For those of us who have never been through it, China's Cultural Revolution,
all started by the leader of the Communist Party, Mao Zedong. To reassert his total control, Mao unleashed what he called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. He empowered radical youth militias, the Red Guards, and gave them a simple mission: destroy the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. Think of it as the most terrifying spring cleaning in history. Schools were shut down, temples and artifacts were smashed to bits. Millions of people, especially teachers and intellectuals, were publicly shamed, beaten, imprisoned, or killed. It was essentially the world's deadliest political purge disguised as cultural reform. Yet it's barely mentioned in Western classrooms. During the fog of World War I,
of World War I is that Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated.
The government of the Ottoman Empire carried out a systematic plan to exterminate its Armenian population. Starting in 1915, about 1.5 million Armenians were murdered through mass executions, torture, and forced death marches into the Syrian desert with no food or water. It was one of the first modern genocides, a crime so horrific that Adolf Hitler himself later used it as an example of how the world looks away from such atrocities. Despite overwhelming historical proof, the Turkish government continues to deny that a genocide ever took place. Because of the political pressure, the event was shamefully omitted or downplayed in schools across the world for decades. In 1921, the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma was one of the wealthiest black communities in America, famously known as Black Wall Street. Then violence erupted after a young black man was falsely accused of assaulting a white woman. A white mob, with some members armed and deputized by city officials.
As soon as the shooting began at the courthouse, the white lynch mob, they didn't care any longer about Dick Rowland.
Descended on Greenwood. The mob looted homes and businesses before setting the entire community on fire. Historians estimate that as many as 300 black residents were murdered. For decades, the massacre was deliberately erased from history. Only recently has this horrific act of domestic terrorism started to enter our history books. A chilling example of how easily the darkest parts of the past can be intentionally buried. And there you have it, 10 forgotten events that completely changed the world, but rarely made it into our textbooks. From English kings losing their heads to the smoldering ruins of Black Wall Street. These stories prove history is far more brutal, complex, and uncomfortable than the clean versions we were taught. So, what historical event do you think is criminally overlooked? Drop it in the comments. And if you learned something new today, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next dive into the history they tried to hide. We'll leave links below for books, documentaries, and even some quirky collectibles tied to these events. So if you want to keep exploring history beyond the classroom, check them out and support the channel at the same time. Because if history is written by the victors, maybe it's up to us to rewrite it with the truth. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay nostalgic.